So do we have any rights? What even are rights, and how do we protect them? Well, fundamentally, rights are divided into two groups, positive and negative rights. Positive rights mean that you will be given or you are entitled to a good or service. So that would be in some countries, for example, housing. Many people believe housing is a right and a human right, and so you should be given or provided with housing. On the other hand, we have negative rights. A negative right simply requires that someone leave you alone. This is probably best known with free speech. So you have the ability to say something, and you are basically guaranteed that no one will stop you or bother you while you are saying that thing. Now, I don't want to delve into any specific rights. I more want to talk about the concept, because I think this concept is at the heart of a discussion that has been going on since everyone is basically stuck at home. There's a lot of confusion over what we're supposed to do and what our rights are. And so I think having a look at rights and where they come from and how we uphold them can really help people illuminate some of the parts of that discussion so that it can actually be fruitful and not devolve into a yelling match as often happens on the internet. Now, I want to start at the very, very beginning. I want to start with the social contract or social contract theory. Now, this is basically the view that your rights and the way that we understand society simply comes from a social contract. We together as a collective have a collective, unwritten, unspoken agreement with each other, and this allows us to have the freedoms and security that we would otherwise not have. Now, one of the earliest people to talk about rights in such a manner is Thomas Hobbes, whose famous work, The Leviathan, goes into a lot of these things. And so Thomas Hobbes is probably most famous for this quotation down here. It's right at the bottom. So he divides the world into two. There's the world with the social contract, and then there's the world of the state of nature. So in the state of nature, it's basically this here. During the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, so this is the social contract, or he's referencing particularly the government, but under the auspices of a social contract. Under the auspices of a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in conditions called war, and such a war as if every man against every man. So basically, every man for himself, you're doing whatever you want. To this war of every man against every man, there is also consequent, that nothing can be unjust, that notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice have no place. Where there is no common power, there is no law. Where no law, no injustice, force and fraud are in war the cardinal virtues. And here's the main part. No arts, no letters, no society, and, which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of a violent death. And the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. You've probably heard that nasty, brutish, and short bit before. But he's basically trying to describe two things. One is, again, the social contract theory with a government or some power to keep all these desires, all these wars between man and against man, and that's, you know, if it's not obvious, between people against people. And so he's basically saying that you're living in a state of nature, right? This is outside of government. This is probably what we would think of as survival of the fittest, to put it in a different context. So this is where there's no rules, nothing is right, nothing is wrong. It's sort of a kill or be killed. Take, you know, whatever works for you, whatever you would like, you have to fight for it. It's a constant war. So this is, on one hand, this is what Hobbes is saying is the opposite. Then we have the social contract. So if we go back here and scroll a bit down, in addition to subjectivism, he infers from this theory that human nature, that humans are exclusively self-interested. Okay, so now he's saying that we are self-interested and we have the capacity for rational thought. So because of these two things, we're able to rationally think about items, and because we are able to be self-interested and understand that self-interest in a rational way, I thought I had another quote. So because of that, we are able to enter into a social contract where, for example, you would like to have something that someone else has, but you recognize that other people have those same desires about you. So you're not going to go and beat up your neighbor and take his sheep or his car or whatever it is, you know, depending on what time period you want to put this context in. So you're not going to do that to your neighbor because you don't want your neighbor to do that to you. You want to have that common security that Hobbes is talking about, that social contract, those unwritten rules where you are behaving in such a manner that facilitates other people to behave in the same manner and therefore you have, in essence, more security and more freedom under the framework or under the constraints even of this new social contract. So one of the things I think most people tend to think about is this here, and this is the American Declaration of Independence. And so the most well-known section in the Declaration of Independence is this: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." So there's a lot to unpack here, and let's examine it line by line. So we have first, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. So right off the bat here, you see that the Declaration of Independence is basically saying that you have these rights regardless of anyone, regardless of any government, social contract, any state, or anything. You have these rights. By virtue of you being born and you being a human person, you have these rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So here we can see the influence of the social contract. So it's, you have these rights, however, to secure these rights, to uphold and protect these rights that you as a God-given person have, you have these rights automatically, but we're gonna create governments and institutions to simply secure these rights. They're not giving you the rights. Government is not giving you the rights, but they're securing them for you. Deriving in their just powers from the consent of the governed. So here again, this is the powers of government are being given to government by people as long as they handle them justly and with the consent of the populace. So this is the American version, and this is what I think a lot of people tend to understand or perceive simply because we're swimming in American culture often, and there's so many movies about the Declaration of Independence. You hear so much about the Constitution, constitutionality, upholding rights and amendments, etc., etc., etc. And so I think a lot of people tend to have this frame of reference. But what does Canada say? What does our Constitution actually say? So if you pull up the Constitution Act 1982, right? So this is when we repatriated our Constitution. We officially got our own Constitution. The highest courts and the highest documents came back and became officially Canadian, no longer British. And again, I don't want to get into those ties and the back and forth, but this is the Constitution Act of 1982, and it is referred to commonly, as you would know, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So this is what is establishing your rights. So right here in the opening, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So right off the bat, this is a very different introduction. Now I know this is not the Declaration of Independence. In many ways, it is, because we are repatriating our Constitution back from the UK, and obviously the same way, much the same way that the US repatriated their Constitution back and had their own Constitution. Although again, they had a civil war and a rebellion. But again, it's sort of the same idea. But now look at the difference here. The reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So right now we're putting out that this document guarantees rights, but there are limits. So right off the bat, there are limits. There's nothing right here in the opening preamble that talks about inalienable rights or where these rights are coming from. So let's go down further, look at the document. Here it's listing the different kind of rights: freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, etc. You guys are, I'm sure, familiar with these. There's a Human Rights Commission, which I'll talk about in a second. But we have down here, legal rights. This is where it's trying to enshrine where are your rights coming from. And so right here we have a bit of a distinction between legal rights, or what some would refer to as natural rights, which are more in line with the US and the American understanding of the sort of God-given rights, of the rights that you have by nature. Here we're diving right into legal rights, and to go off on a bit of a tangent for a second about why that's not necessarily an issue is because ultimately, as with the American Constitution and the American Declaration of Independence, you have here that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. And let's pause, because this is a super, super interesting and super important point we need to all remember. That these rights, in essence, regardless of where they're coming from, both sides recognize that you require a state or social contract. And so here we're looking at the legalistic aspect of it, and we'll dive a bit deeper into that. But this is the legalistic aspect of how we're going to enforce and protect those rights. So again, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and the right not to be deprived thereof, except in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. Okay, another bone thrown to you, another sort of wrench in understanding what this is. What are the principles of fundamental justice? What is that? That's kind of confusing. You might have a vague idea. So what does the charter say? What does the government have to say about this? So if we scroll down here, you can see that the fundamental justice it's talking about here. The principles of fundamental justice are not limited to procedural matters, right? So not just the how we enforce these rights and the acts and laws and regulations, but includes substantive principles of fundamental justice. Again, what are substantive principles? Let's go down further. Substantive principles of fundamental justice include the principles against arbitrariness, overbreadth, and gross disproportionality. A deprivation of a right will be arbitrary and thus unjustifiably limit Section 7 if it bears no connection to the law's purpose. So you have a law that if you say something that you're not supposed to say, your house will be taken away. That would be disproportional. If you have a law that says that you cannot go past a certain speed limit, but people are using that law to enforce something that's totally irrelevant, it again bears no connection to the law's purpose, because the purpose is to have speed limits and to ensure safe operation of a motor vehicle on roads. And so this is kind of what you're getting from the Canadian Constitution, and this is where we're at on a more legalistic and procedural basis. So we're not really looking at the pie in the sky idea in our Constitution about where rights come from or what they are in a sort of abstract sense. It's almost similar to Plato's Forms, if you're familiar, where there is the idea of a table, and there's many different tables out there, but there is some universal concept of a table that exists, and everyone is able to sort of tap into that universal understanding of what a table is. That's why we know instinctively what is or is not or can or cannot be used as a table. And so that's kind of the pie in the sky edition, and we're looking more in Canada at the fundamental and the practical. Now we have the Human Rights Commission, which talks about human rights in Canada. And so human rights, but wait a second, how does human rights differ from regular rights? So this website provides an interesting analysis. In simplest terms, the difference between a human and a civil right is why you have them. Human rights arise simply by being a human. So this is the American understanding, these inalienable rights, you can add in given to you by your creator, or again, simply just because you're human, you have these rights. Civil rights, on the other hand, arise by virtue of a legal grant of a right. And so these are the ones that you have to have the government giving you or enforcing for you or upholding for you. These are the ones, the civil rights that is given to you by government. So this might be more akin to affirmative action type of rights or other type of rights that the government then has to give, and it is only because you are a citizen or a member of that group or country then you have those rights. But back to the Human Rights Commission. So again, we have sort of where are we getting these rights, and it lists two fundamental documents: the Canadian Human Rights Act of 1977 and the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Now I know I'm not the biggest fan of the UN. I think there's many problems with the UN. I know a lot of readers and viewers are obviously not fans of the United Nations, and especially right now there's a lot of talk about that. But the UN Declaration of Human Rights is an important document nonetheless to look at, especially for our legal apparatus and the way that we're structuring governments and societies right now. So there's the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and again, it goes through different rights, but you'll notice that it doesn't have those inalienable God-given rights that the American Declaration of Independence does. And that's possibly simply because of the time that it was written, 1776 versus 1948 for this, or for 1982 for the Canadian Charter. But more than that, let's think about it again in a more practical manner, talking about rights and why a social contract is important, but also what we need to do about it and what we need to think about it. So you can imagine this sort of state of nature, this arbitrary position where there's no right, there's no government, it's just kind of you hanging out with your family. Maybe you have a farm, maybe you're a hunter-gatherer, you're just kind of out there in the state of nature. And someone wants to take one of your things. So now it's either, you against them, you'll have to fight them to protect your things, and that's really where we're at. If you're weak, then someone will take your stuff. You go out, you have your family, maybe your immediate family or your larger family. They can help you protect your rights. There's an unwritten agreement in your family that this is how we operate. We all have private property. We all have, certain rights. I'm not going to go into your hut. You're not going to go into my hut. If someone from outside wants to go into these huts, I'll help defend you. You'll help defend me, etc., etc. You extrapolate that out. You can get from a family to a clan to a tribe to a nation, and then in the largest and most abstract sense, to a government. And so rights are, in essence, something that is upheld by the government. And so really what I want the purpose of this video to be about is to get in people's minds the understanding and the thought that regardless of where these rights are coming from, I mean, if you're a non-believer, then you don't believe that you're endowed with any inalienable rights by a creator, because there is no creator. So you can't be given some arbitrary pie in the sky rights by a little man in the clouds, because that man doesn't exist. If you are a believer, you might believe that you have these God-given rights, and that people do not have the right, to use that term here again, people do not have the right to violate your rights and to take away your things or take your private property or harm you in any sort of way, because you have those rights. But you're still stuck where the government is the guarantor of those rights. Or, for lack of a better term, if you don't prefer government, society, again, if you're going to the smaller ones, family, clan, tribe, nation, those are more societal based. There's no official government apparatus. So why does this matter? Why is it important to talk about rights, and why is it important to talk about now? Well, obviously, right now, there is some suspension of rights. People, I think, people are angry with some of the stay-at-home orders. They're getting tired of this. It's been quite a long time. A number of people have been home already for 50 days straight without really going anywhere except perhaps the grocery store, maybe to the park, maybe to have a driveway beer if their neighbors are not snitching on them. So people are very upset about their rights being violated. And so it is important for us as Canadians to understand the concept of rights, where our rights come from, when they are being violated, when is it a justifiable violation of those rights, and understanding how we can remedy the situation to protect our rights in the future. Because there may be situations where your rights have to be violated. You commit a crime, you don't have rights, you lose certain rights because now the state is apprehending you and you are going to be put on trial, or you're going to face some sort of punishment. So there's obviously times when you have to violate somebody's rights, and that is something that we as a society all agree. But as a nation, as a populace, we have to understand these rights. We have to pay attention when our rights are slipping away. What are the rights that we expect our government to uphold, and how do we guarantee that the government go and do that? So I want to come back and examine this issue and maybe talk about a couple of specific rights and how we can really move forward, because I think right now, during this COVID crisis, it's an excellent time for everyone to reacquaint themselves with some of these concepts, because when we come out of this, there's going to be a lot of questions. Did we overreact? Did we underreact? We're right now in the middle. I'm making this video. This is sort of in the middle still. We're maybe 50 days in. This is in just the beginning of May. But there's a lot of questions, and hindsight is obviously going to be 2020. But we're going to have to look back and say, were these things justifiable? Did we make the right decisions? How can we make those decisions better? So I want everyone to sort of think about rights, about human rights, about natural rights and inalienable rights, and where these rights are coming from, how we can protect ourselves, how we can uphold these rights, and let's have that discussion. Let's throw some ideas down in the comments. Let's subscribe so we can get the latest update and see what a lot of the other True North contributors are talking about, because they're also talking about a lot of these things, even if they're not outlining it in such direct terms. But let's have that conversation, and let's come back in a little bit and see what everybody thinks and what we can't pull out of this conversation to make it better, and hopefully come out of this crisis as a much stronger, freer, and better country. So thank you so much. Take care. Wash your hands. Stay safe. And I'm Sam Eskenasi for True North. Have a great day, a great evening, and be safe. Take care.